So let's go ahead and try and rewrite these expressions. So there's 4 expressions here, and we want to try and rewrite them in an equivalent expression without absolute value. So basically we want to try and use these conditions to try and find equivalent expressions. So we have the absolute value of x minus 1, and we're told if x is greater than 1, find an equivalent expression. So if x is greater than 1, let's go ahead and just like test a value. So let's test like x equals 2. So if we test x equals 2 and we plug it in, let's see what happens in this. So the absolute value of 2 minus 1 is the absolute value of 1. And we know the absolute value of 1 is just 1. So in this situation, when I plug 2 in, my result is exactly the same as my simplified argument, right? So once I simplify my argument, I get the same result as what was put in, right? So in this situation, that's telling me that for x values greater than 1, the absolute value of x minus 1 is just going to be exactly the same thing as we have in our argument. So it's giving us the same value. But if I pick a number, let's say, now we're looking at the other side, if absolute value of x minus 1, if x is less than 1. So again, we can test a value. Let's go ahead and test x equals 0. I like to test 0 whenever I can, whenever it meets those conditions. So plug it in, absolute value of 0 minus 1. That's the absolute value of negative 1. We know the absolute value of negative 1 is just 1. So in this situation, my simplified argument gives me the opposite. So for any value of x less than 1, when I plug it in, my result is going to be the opposite of what I have. So this tells me that the absolute value of x minus 1 is equal to the opposite of my argument. And if you wanted to simplify this, you could distribute the negative through to give you negative x plus 1. But this happens when x is less than 1. Okay, so let's look at another example. So we have the absolute value of 3 minus x if x is greater than 3. So go ahead and test a point again. So let's say, let's test when x is 5, let's say. So absolute value of 3 minus 5 is the absolute value of negative 2. The absolute value of negative 2 is just positive 2. So in this situation, my simplified argument is giving me the opposite of what I have in here. So that means that the absolute value of 3 minus x for all x values greater than 3 is going to be the opposite of 3 minus x. And again, if you wanted to distribute through, you could. And this is for x greater than 3. What if x is less than 3? So let's go ahead and test again. Again, 0 works in this, so I'm going to test when x is 0. So the absolute value of 3 minus 0 is equal to the absolute value of 3, which is just 3. So my simplified argument ended up being the same thing as, I ended up getting out the same thing as my simplified argument, which means the absolute value of 3 minus x is just going to be 3 minus x for x values less than 3. And that's going to be, we're basically going to be using this information to help us kind of redefine absolute value functions. Now, one question is, where am I getting like the 3 from and the 1 from? Why am I picking 3 and 1? Are these just arbitrary random numbers that I picked that I wanted to test? Not quite. So the way that we get these conditions for my argument is by looking at the argument, what's inside the absolute value, and asking ourselves, what makes this 0? What makes this 0? So if you can see in x minus 1, if I plug in 1, 1 minus 1 is 0. Same thing here, right? If I plug in 3 to this, right, what makes this 0? Well, 3 minus 3 is 0. And so that's kind of our cutoff point for the absolute value, right? If you think about the absolute value function, we know that it has like a V shape, and one side has a positive slope and one side has a negative slope. And there's that one point at which it changes. And that one point, that one x value, is determined by what makes the argument, what makes the inside of the absolute value equal to 0. So we're going to use this information to help us rewrite an entire absolute value function using different conditions.